Hey there, I'm Jillian Stiles, and I'm the community manager here at Pixelpop. I'm happy to introduce our next session, Designing Board Games for Inclusivity, with our speaker, Mattie Schraeder. Mattie is a transgender game designer, blogger, and software engineer. She recently signed her first game design for publication. So please give a round of applause and a warm welcome to Mattie.
Hi, and welcome to Pixelpop Festival 2020. I'm Mattie Schraeder, and this is Designing Board Games for Inclusivity, how to be inclusive in your design without sacrificing your creative vision. A little about myself. I'm from Springfield, Illinois, and I'm a software engineer by trade. I've worked in the library, manufacturing, and healthcare industries. As a hobbyist board game designer, I've worked on 2 games so far. The first is Walking Doggos, which I self published about 2 years ago, but recently got signed by Sapphire City Games to be published under the tentative title Heckin' Hounds. I've also worked on a game called White Hat, which an early prototype of was shown at Pixelpop 2019. And lastly, I'm a board member for the board game convention Geekway to the West, which hosts 3,000 attendees every year in St. Louis, Missouri, and you should come check us out. So, let's talk about inclusivity. Unfortunately, the board game industry and the board game hobby is a very niche hobby. Unlike a lot of media we consume, like the video game industry, the movie industry, the TV industry, it's much more niche. So we don't have a big audience comparatively, but you still want to cast as wide a net as possible to find your audience. You do this largely by working with diverse people, by bringing in playtesters and artists, and your publisher could bring in people from all walks of life to help you make your game better. And that makes your game more inclusive just by the fact that more diverse people are working on your game. And we want more people in the hobby. So by designing inclusivity into your game, you're bringing people into the hobby that might not have otherwise seen it. They might play your game because they saw something in it that spoke to them as a person that wouldn't have in a lot of other board games. And I want to stress that just because you're not being exclusive doesn't make you inclusive. Just because you're not specifically excluding someone from your game or your hobby doesn't mean you're opening the door and bringing them in and including them into it. And lastly, not all games require the same kinds or amounts of inclusivity. So, how do you be inclusive in your design? There's basically 5 ways. There's art, theme, player interactions, rules, and mechanics. And we'll talk about those all in detail. So let's go ahead and start. Art. Art is the easiest way to be inclusive, and it's the thing you have the least amount of control over. It's also, as a designer, the thing you're least worried about through most of your design. When a publisher picks up your game, they're going to redo the artwork, redo the graphic design, and hire new artists and graphic designers. And you want, as a designer, to make your art not necessarily be inclusive, but you want your art to show a publisher what it could be if the publisher picked it up. And if you're self-publishing, of course, art is going to matter. So let's talk about Fort. Fort is a really cute game about kids building forts, eating pizza, and collecting friends. The cover of this is brilliant because it shows kids from all walks of life, indiscriminate gender, indiscriminate race, all having fun and just doing kid things, and you can't really be more inclusive than that. That's everything that you want in art, and it's done in such a unique way because gender and race isn't something that the game has to be about, so it's not, but they can still show people of all sorts of walks of life on the cover, and that's really cool. Next up is theme. Theme is another thing that designers don't have a ton of control over because a publisher could pick up your game and retheme it or change the theme a little bit or make some changes to it. And as a designer, you want to pick a theme that casts that wide net that we talked about. You want to pick a theme that shows a publisher what you're shooting for as far as an audience is. And one problem with theme in board games is that they're very redundant of each other. They're colonialism, there's war, conflict. That's a lot of themes in board games. And those themes aren't really inclusive because there's a lot of people that those themes won't appeal to. And a good example of a theme that can appeal to a bigger audience is Prêt-à-Porter. This is a game about fashion design. You're the owner of a fashion design company and you have to design clothes, hire employees, run fashion shows, and sell your clothes, all while making a profit. And if you fire your employees, one of the really cool thematic features of it is that if you fire an employee, you have to give them a severance package. You can't just let them go. And that's really cool. Next up is player interactions. And there's a YouTube video that talks a lot about these player interactions, so I'll link that down below, hopefully. But there's 4 types of player interactions in your game. How players interact with each other, generally. And there's an ortho game, which is a typical game. It's a competition with a clear winner. It's players working against each other to find a winner and a loser. There's also an ideo game. And this is basically where you make interesting decisions throughout the game for a personal outcome. This is something like building a city or a civilization or creating a character. And at the end of the game, you can point at something you did throughout the game and say, I did that. This is something I built. Regardless of winning or losing, you built this thing. And next up is a role-playing game. We all know role-playing games. These are basically collaborative storytelling. This is working together through your table to tell a complete story, and that's a very inclusive process because the players are interacting with each other in a very positive way. Lastly is the pseudo game. And I'm not a big fan of this term, but I haven't found one I like better. But it's basically a shared amusing activity. Most games are pseudo games, but not all games have to be more than a pseudo game. So this is like charades or Pictionary, where you don't really keep track of score. You don't really have a clear winner or loser. You're just having fun drawing or acting out or doing something that's amusing you and your friends. So that's player interactions. Next up are rules. Rules are one of the things designers have the most control over. Rules are something where it's the first experience a player has with your game. And you don't want to use purely he pronouns in your game. You don't want to open up a rule book, and this is especially in my group, is basically for women. And we sit around a table and we play a game, and I open the rule book, and the first thing it says is, he does this, he does that. And that's so frustrating, especially as a transgender player, because I'm misgendering myself just by reading your rule book, and that doesn't feel good. And you don't want players to not feel good playing your game. So there are some things you can do to make this better. You can use singular they, which is great, but it can be a little confusing. Who is they? If you say they do this, they do that, that's super inclusive, but it can be confusing, so you have to be careful to specify who they is. Another thing you can do is have example named players, each with their own pronouns. That helps a lot and is really great in examples. But what I like to do is just say the player, the active player, the inactive player. Just refer to the player as the player, and then you can't really go wrong. You also don't want to make assumptions about your players. Have they played similar games to yours? Do they know the standard definitions for things in your game? If they don't know what a trick-taking game is, and they don't know what a trick is, then how can they know what taking a trick means? So you have to use language in your games that won't be confusing to new players, but will still make sense to players who are seasoned veterans of the hobby. And lastly, the length of the rulebook matters, because it's not enough to be short. If it's too short, it can be confusing and not clear enough. If it's too long, it can overwhelm. You have to be careful about the length of your rulebook, and that's different for every game. An example of a really great rulebook is Wingspan. This is a game designed by Elizabeth Hargrave, and in the rulebook, they're very specific to use you for almost everything. It's you do this, you do that, the player does this. It's very clear that it's for everybody just by reading the rules, and that's wonderful. Lastly are mechanisms or mechanics. There's a whole list of mechanics on Board Game Geek. Once again, the link will be below. But you don't want to make people be mean to each other. You don't want to have... Mechanics are basically how the players interact with the game. And if the game requires players to be mean to each other, you're going to be excluding some people. And that makes the game not fun for some people. You want to use your game mechanics to bring people together, to give players agency, so players feel like they're affecting the game and affecting their players in positive ways. And even in a game that has take that mechanics, where players are directly competing with each other, you want to make it so they're not being mean about how they compete with each other. So Medium is a good example of this. Medium is a game about bringing people closer together. It's about finding the medium between two words. And two players come up with a word, and then they have to come up with the word between the two simultaneously. And that's really cool. It's about bringing people together. So I want to talk about some of my experiences and how I fixed them. First is Walking Doggos. Walking Doggos I showed off at Gen Con last year, and somebody came to my booth and said, there's no way this game was designed by a straight person. And that was some of the best criticism that I've gotten about my game ever, because it showed that everything I did to make Walking Doggos feel inclusive worked. It spoke to somebody to show them that they're included in my game, that the hobby that's typically very cis, very white, very male could be more than that. And that's what I wanted to do with Walking Doggos. And I basically did that by making it colorful, by making a theme that people can relate to, that's not common in the industry. And all the game is dogs and pretty colors. And it worked. So when it got published, when I got signed with Sapphire City Games, I was really worried about what would happen to the design, because I wanted to keep that positive inclusivity. And this is what happened. We have a tentative artist in mind, who's Lauren Brown. She's worked on a Kickstarter that's on live right now. It's on Kickstarter at Deck of Wonders. You should check it out. And she makes this really awesome, inclusive fantasy art. And I love it. And my designer found this artist. This wasn't me. I went to my publisher and I was like, I want my games to be inclusive, and that means something to me. And I realize it's a game about dogs, but it should still scream that inclusivity that means so much to me. And my publisher did that. My publisher found this artist that it's amazing, and I love her art. So that's Heck and Hounds. Coming out hopefully sometime soon. We'll hear a bit more about it. So next up is White Hat. White Hat is a computer science themed game. It's about hacking. And computer science is another unfortunate, very cis, very white, very male audience. And I wanted to make a game about hacking, but how do you make that inclusive? The original prototype art was a dude sitting in a computer, and I didn't want a dude on my cover, because that's reinforcing the gender barrier of computer science. And I think I can do better. And I did do better. So I redesigned the box art to be more inclusive. And that was the first thing I did. And there's still more to do, because it's not published yet. It's unpublished. So I can still work on coming up with more ways of making it inclusive. So let's talk about some case studies of actually published. You can buy these games on the market right now. The first is Spirit Island. Spirit Island is an amazing game by Greater Than Games here in St. Louis, and it's a game about reverse colonialism. I talked a little bit earlier that colonialism was a theme that is very popular in the board game industry, but what you don't see is a world game about defeating the colonialists, protecting an island from invaders, and that's what Spirit Island is. You play as spirits, and it's a cooperative game, which is really cool because players win and lose as a team. So that's very inclusive because you don't have a player that just plays badly and feels bad, because everybody's working together. Everybody will be helping one another to win, and that's wonderful. It's an ideal game because as you play, the spirits that you're playing as become more powerful. They gain cards and abilities that let them do more things to affect the world in more specific ways. And at the end of the game, you can look at your spirit and be like, I made this spirit be awesome. And that's really cool. And there's a little bit of a role-playing mechanic in that the cards have titles and flavor text and art that all talk about what you're doing when you play these cards. They're not just playing a card to affect somebody on the board. It's actually, oh, I'm creating the rain coming down and making mud so the explorers can't explore as easily and stuff like that. It's really cool. So that's Spirit Island. Next, I want to talk about Fantasy Flight Games' Arkham Horror Files. There's a lot of games in this series of games by Fantasy Flight, and they're all very similar, so I'm kind of lumping them all together. They're mostly cooperative, the exception being Mansions of Madness First Edition, which had a GM-type character that would kind of play against the other players. And then Mansions of Madness Second Edition did away with the GM character by having an app that runs the game for you. It doesn't need a GM anymore. It just needs the app that tells players what to do. And that makes the game way more inclusive because you don't even have to know how to play. You just have to have somebody set it up, and you have to have somebody get it up and running. But then once the app is up, you can just sit down and play. It's super easy. And all these games are heavy in their storytelling. They're all about the adventure of defeating the Cthulhu mythos and defeating monsters and surviving H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. But yes, I said H.P. Lovecraft. How can a series of games about H.P. Lovecraft's mythos be inclusive? Fantasy Flight did it, and it's amazing. These are all the characters that you start with in Eldritch Horror. They are young, old, black, white, Asian, indigenous, conventionally attractive, conventionally unattractive. There's people from all walks of life, rich, poor. It's amazing. They all have different jobs. They all have different roles in the world. And that's so exciting to see in something that is traditionally not inclusive. And I want to specify just how awesome this is. This is Stella Clark. She was just released in the Arkham Horror card game this week, and she's coming to the other games eventually, I'm sure. But her story is amazing. Before she began working for the Postal Service in Arkham, Stella knew two things with certainty. First, her parents made a mistake when they called her their son and gave her a boy's name. Second, the house on the cliff in Kingsport whispered her true name, the name she chose for herself. Late at night, Stella. Delivering the mail 6 days a week in all kinds of weather wasn't an easy job, but Stella loved knowing that she was helping people connect with one another. Then she started finding the letters. At the end of her route, there was always one extra envelope in her bag. It was always addressed to her. It was always postmarked from Kingsport, and it always contained a letter with one carefully typed word. Stella. Stella is amazing because her gender is an inextricable part of her story. and yet it's not her whole story. And the mechanics in the game don't make her being transgender a thing. They don't mean anything. It's just a part of her character. But it's not just a part of her character because it's a part of who she is. And her transgender transition story is tied to the mythos, which is really cool. It's a part of the mystery that needs solving. It builds empathy for the character. And that is really exciting and really awesome. And I can't think of a single other transgender representation in the entire board game industry as well done as Stella Clark. So thank you, Fantasy Flight Games. This was amazing to see, and she's amazing. And that's what I got. Thank you so much for watching and listening. My name is Mattie Schraeder. Once again, you can find me on Twitter at @afrozenpeach or on Discord at frozenpeach number 0001, or you can email me at mattie@mattie.lgbt. Thank you so much, and enjoy Pixelpop Festival.
Thank you so much to Mattie for such a great presentation, and thank you everyone for watching. Please be sure to head over to our Pixelpop Festival Discord server at discord.gg/pxp to continue the discussion and participate in the live Q&As happening in our Q&A breakout room. Now stay tuned for our next session.